This is the Battle of the South Pacific. Dang it!
Battle of Coral Sea.
The first battle was the Battle of Coral Sea, fought on May 4th to May 8th in 1942. This was a major naval battle in the Pacific theater of World War II, between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Naval Air Forces of the United States and Australia. Overall, there was 1,622 deaths and 656 American soldiers killed, but it does seem that the Japanese suffered more casualties with 966 deaths. It was between Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. On the last 2 days of the battle between the U.S. and the Japanese, they exchanged airstrikes. The first day, the U.S. sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho, while the Japanese sank the U.S. destroyer and heavily damaged a fleet oiler, which was later scuttled. The next day, the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku was heavily damaged. The U.S. fleet carrier Lexington was critically damaged. The Yorktown was damaged, with both sides having suffered heavy losses and the aircraft carriers damaged or sunk. The two fleets disengaged and retired from the battle area.
Battle of Eastern Solomons. Battle of Eastern Solomons, aka the Battle of Stewart Islands. August 24th and August 25th of 1942. This was the third carrier battle of the Pacific Campaign of World War II. On the U.S. side, one carrier heavily damaged, 20 aircraft destroyed, and 90 killed. On the Japanese side, one light carrier, one destroyer, one transport sunk, one light cruiser, one seaplane tender heavily damaged, and 75 aircraft destroyed. 290 plus killed. Both the Japanese and the U.S. elected to completely withdraw their warships from the area, ending the battle.
Battle of Santa Cruz.
The Battle of Santa Cruz. This battle was also known as the Battle of the South Pacific, according to the Japanese. This was the fourth carrier battle in the Pacific Campaign. It lasted 3 days, from October 25th to 27th of 1942. In this battle, the U.S. had 2 carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 136 aircraft, while the Japanese had 3 carrier fleets, 1 light carrier, 4 battleships, 10 cruisers, 22 destroyers, and 199 aircraft. The U.S. had 1 carrier sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 1 carrier heavily damaged, 2 destroyers heavily damaged, and 81 aircraft destroyed. 266 Americans died. The Japanese had 1 carrier heavily damaged, 1 light carrier heavily damaged, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, and 99 aircraft destroyed, while there were 455 Japanese dead. Although, in the short term, it was a tactical victory for the Japanese, long term it was bad for the Japanese because there were many veteran aircrew lost that were irreplaceable. This was the Battle of Santa Cruz.
Battle of Guadalcanal.
The Battle of Guadalcanal. The Battle of Guadalcanal was also known as the Guadalcanal Campaign. The Battle of Guadalcanal took place in 1942 when the U.S. Marines landed on August 7th. The landing of Guadalcanal was unstopped. It took the Americans 6 months to defeat the Japanese in what turned out to be a classic battle of artillery. The battle ended on February 9, 1943. The location was in Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands. The result was a strategic Allied victory. This battle was the beginning of an Allied operations in the Pacific. 60,000 men, ground forces for the U.S., and there were 36,200 men for the Japanese. For the U.S., at the end, there were 7,100 dead, 4 captured, 29 ships lost, and 650 aircraft lost. For the Japanese, there were 31,000 dead, 1,000 captures, and 38 ships lost, and 683 aircraft lost. This is the Battle of Guadalcanal.
It was sad.
The Battle of New Britain.
The Battle of New Britain. The New Britain campaign was a World War II campaign by the Allies between December 1943 and the end of the war in August of 1945. To contain Japanese forces concentrated in Rabaul, the capital of New Britain. The Allied forces had less than 20,000 troops, while the Japanese had over 100,000 troops. The result of the war was an Allied victory.
This is the Battle of Guam. The Battle of Guam was a relatively long battle, as it was 20 days. The Battle of Guam was the American capture of the Japanese-held island of Guam, a United States territory during the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Guam is the largest of the Marianas. At the beginning, the U.S. had 36,000 soldiers and 1,747 were killed, and 6,053 were wounded. Japan had 22,000 soldiers and 18,040 plus were killed, and 485 were prisoners of war. After the battle, Guam was turned into an Allied base for Allied operations.
1001. 1002. Oh, you caught me off guard there. Well, anyways, just thought I'd tell you about the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
One.
The Battle of Leyte, formerly known as the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea. It is also known as one of the largest naval battles of World War II. It was fought near the Philippine Islands on October 23rd through the 26th, 1944. It was the first battle in which Japanese carried out organized kamikaze attacks. On the U.S. side, we had about 800 ships total, 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 18 escort carriers, 12 battleships, 24 cruisers, and 166 destroyers. And on top of that, we had about 1,500 planes. On the Japanese side, they had a much smaller fleet of only about 67 ships. 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 9 battleships, 14 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 35 plus destroyers, and they had about 300 planes. Overall, it was a very successful attack for the U.S. to cut off Japanese communication with their southeast of Asia, and we actually pretty much destroyed them in this war, with only having 2,800 casualties and only losing 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 200 planes. On the other hand, they lost 12,500 people, 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, and all of their planes. Overall, this is one of the major turnarounds in the war, and it was pretty good for the U.S. Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th to the 20th, 1944, was a decisive naval battle of World War II, which limited the Imperial Japanese naval abilities to conduct large-scale carrier actions. It took place during the United States' oblivious invasion of the Mariana Islands during the Pacific War. The U.S. had 7 fleet carriers, 8 light fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, and 58 destroyers. Oh, and also 28 submarines and 956 carrier aircrafts. The Japanese had 5 carriers, 4 light carriers, 5 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 27 destroyers, and 24 submarine and 6 oilers. And they had around 450 aircraft carriers. The U.S. had 1 battleship damaged, 123 aircraft were destroyed. The Japanese had 3 carriers sunk, 2 oilers sunk, and about 550 to about 645 aircraft destroyed. 6 other ships damaged. The Americans won this battle.
America!
America!
This is the family life of many Americans during World War II.
Come here, need more! How was it?
One.
So they were really poor, so they had to use boxes and shoes.
Battle of Guadalcanal. Battle of Guadalcanal.
Battle of Philippine Sea. The Battle of... Battle of the Philippine Sea. Stop, LJ! I'm trying to... This is the Battle of the Philippine Sea. I can't do it.